In 1933, the United States was not simply in a recession. It was in a state of existential crisis. The Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash of 1929, had by then become the worst economic catastrophe in modern American history. Nearly 4 years after the collapse, the economy was still in freefall. Industrial production had been cut almost in half. More than 13 million Americans, roughly 1/4 of the workforce, were unemployed. Banks had failed by the thousands. Entire life savings had vanished overnight. Across the country, the physical landscape itself seemed to reflect the collapse. Factories that had once powered the world's largest industrial economy stood silent, their smokestacks called against a gray sky. In the countryside, farmers watched their crops rot or blow away as dust. Prices had collapsed so completely that in many places it cost more to harvest food than to sell it. Fields were left abandoned. Livestock was slaughtered because there was no market for it. In cities, the human cost was impossible to ignore. Men who had once been accountants, managers, lawyers, and engineers stood in breadlines that stretched for blocks. Families lived in makeshift shantytowns built from scrap wood, cardboard, and sheet metal. These settlements became known as Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the government's inaction. Malnutrition-related diseases began to return to a country that had believed itself immune to such things. Suicide rates soared. Families broke apart under the pressure. The American social contract. The belief that hard work guaranteed stability was collapsing. But the economic crisis was only half the story. By 1933, the political system itself seemed too many Americans to be failing. Across the world, democracy was under siege. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already built a fascist dictatorship. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had just been appointed chancellor in January 1933. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin claimed to have eliminated unemployment entirely through total state control of the economy. To millions of desperate people, these authoritarian systems did not look like tyranny. They looked like order. The idea that democracy was too slow, too weak, too divided to handle crises was spreading everywhere. The United States was not immune to these fears. In union halls, in bars, in newspapers, and in political clubs, Americans openly debated whether the system could survive. Some talked about socialism. Others talked about strong leadership. Still others whispered about revolution. Fear had become the dominant political emotion of the age, and nowhere was that fear more intense than among the country's economic elite. The men who controlled the great banks, the steel companies, the chemical trusts, the railroads, and the insurance empires watched the situation with growing panic. They saw strikes. They saw protests. They saw veterans marching on Washington demanding early payment of their bonuses in 1932. They saw hunger, anger, and desperation mixing into something volatile. They remembered the French Revolution. They remembered Russia in 1917. They were terrified that the American public might one day come for them. In March 1933, into this atmosphere of collapse and fear, stepped a new president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. To the unemployed and the desperate, Roosevelt sounded like salvation. In his inaugural address, he famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He promised a new deal for the American people. He promised massive government intervention, public works programs, banking reform, job creation, social protections. He moved quickly, closing the banks, stabilizing the financial system, and launching an unprecedented expansion of federal power. To millions of ordinary Americans, Roosevelt became a symbol of hope. But too much of the financial and industrial elite, he was something else entirely. He was a traitor to his class. Roosevelt came from one of the oldest and wealthiest families in America. He had been educated at Groton and Harvard. He was supposed to defend the existing order. Instead, he began to dismantle parts of it. In April 1933, he took the United States off the gold standard, devaluing the dollar to fight deflation and help debtors. This single decision wiped out enormous amounts of wealth held in bonds and financial instruments tied to gold. To bankers and large investors, it felt like legalized theft. Then came banking regulations, public spending, labor protections, higher taxes on the wealthy, and the first steps toward Social Security. To many corporate leaders, this looked like the beginning of socialism. Some openly compared Roosevelt to European radicals. Others whispered that he was destroying the foundations of American capitalism. The word dictator began to appear in private conversations and hostile editorials. A powerful coalition of business interests formed in 1934. The American Liberty League. Publicly, it claimed to defend the Constitution and free enterprise. In reality, it served as an organized center of opposition to the New Deal, funded by some of the richest families in the country, including figures linked to DuPont, General Motors, and major banking interests. At the same time, something darker was happening beneath the surface. Some wealthy Americans were no longer talking about elections, lobbying, or court challenges. They were talking about regime change. They were watching Europe and drawing dangerous conclusions. If Mussolini could save Italy with authoritarian rule, and if Hitler could restore Germany through discipline and nationalism, then maybe, just maybe, America needed its own strong man. Not a visible dictator. Not at first, but a controlled transformation of power. A government that looked constitutional on the surface, while real authority moved elsewhere. And todo, that they needed one thing above all: the loyalty of the soldiers. They needed a man who could command the respect of veterans. A hero. A symbol. A general. And in 1933, there was no more famous or respected living Marine in America than Major General Smedley Darlington Butler. He was about to become the most dangerous man in the United States. Not because he wanted power, but because he refused it. Smedley Darlington Butler was not an ordinary retired officer. In 1933, he was one of the most famous soldiers in America, a living symbol of the Marine Corps and of American military power. He had served for more than 30 years, fought in the Philippines, in China during the Bokso Rebellion, throughout Central America and the Caribbean, and in France during the First World War. He had commanded men in combat, led charges, lived in trenches, and survived wounds and disease. He was one of the very few men in American history to have received the Medal of Honor twice. To the public, he was I. To veterans, he was a legend. His reputation for personal courage and for loyalty to the men under his command was unmatched. When Butler spoke, soldiers listened. When he walked into a room, people paid attention. He was exactly the kind of figure who could move large numbers of angry, unemployed veterans in any direction he chose. Yet by the early 1930s, Butler had become deeply disillusioned. After retiring from the Marine Corps, he had time to reflect on his career and on the wars he had fought. The conclusion he reached was bitter and shocking, even to himself. He came to believe that most of the conflicts he had participated in had not been fought for democracy or freedom, but for the financial interests of banks and corporations. He publicly described himself as a high-class muscle man for big business, and said that he had helped make the world safe not for democracy, but for profits. He spoke openly about how American troops had been used to protect the interests of companies in Haiti, Nicaragua, Honduras, and elsewhere. These speeches made him extremely popular with ordinary veterans and deeply unpopular with the political and business establishment. By 1933, he was no longer seen as a reliable defender of the system, but many wealthy men had not been listening carefully to what he was actually saying. In the summer of 1933, Butler was living quietly on his farm in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, trying to put his military life behind him. It was there that the first approach came. A man named Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman with connections to Wall Street, arrived with another visitor, Bill Doyle, who Butler knew from veterans organizations. McGuire presented himself as the representative of a group of wealthy, patriotic Americans who were concerned about the condition of World War I veterans and angry about President Roosevelt's decision to take the country off the gold standard. He claimed they wanted Butler to help organize veterans politically, to pressure the government into paying bonuses in gold rather than paper currency. At first, the proposal sounded like a political campaign, but almost immediately, Butler sensed that something was wrong. McGuire was nervous, evasive, and far too well-funded for a simple veterans lobbying effort. At one point, he produced a large amount of cash, roughly $18,000, and offered it to Butler to cover expenses. In the depths of the Depression, this was an enormous sum of money. Butler refused the cash, but he did not end the conversation. Instead, he decided to listen. Over the following months, McGuire returned repeatedly. He paid for expensive dinners, luxury hotels, and travel. He flattered Butler constantly, emphasizing his influence over veterans and his legendary status. Slowly, and with growing confidence, he began to reveal more of the true plan. The gold issue, he explained, was only part of it. The men behind him believed that Roosevelt was destroying the country, that democracy was failing, and that America needed a stronger form of government. McGuire admitted that he had been sent to Europe at their expense to study the political movements of the time. He spoke admiringly of Mussolini's Italy and of right-wing paramilitary organizations in France. He described how these groups could be used to control unrest and impose order. What he was really proposing was not a protest movement, but the creation of a private army of veterans, loyal not to the Constitution, but to the interests of powerful businessmen. Eventually, McGuire stopped hiding the scale of the ambition. He told Butler that the plan was to recruit hundreds of thousands of veterans, arm them, and bring them to Washington in a massive show of force. Officially, it would be a patriotic demonstration. In reality, it would be a coup. Roosevelt would be pressured to accept a new position, a Secretary of General Affairs, who would take over the real executive power of the government. The president would remain as a figurehead, while the country would be run by this unelected authority. It was a model directly inspired by European fascist regimes. And McGuire told Butler, without hesitation, that he was the man they wanted for this role. Butler listened without revealing his reaction. Inside, he was furious. He understood immediately that he was being asked to participate in treason. But he also understood something else. McGuire was not acting alone. He was a messenger. Killing the messenger, or simply rejecting him, would not stop the plot. It would only send the conspirators to find another general who might say yes. So Butler chose a different path. He pretended to be interested. He asked questions. He demanded proof. He wanted to know who was really behind the plan and how far it went. That proof came in the form of a meeting with Robert Sterling Clark, a millionaire heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. Clark confirmed everything. He spoke openly about his hatred of the New Deal, about the need to protect wealth and order, and about his willingness to spend enormous sums of money to make it happen. He even attempted to bribe Butler directly. Unbeknownst to Clark and McGuire, Butler had brought along a journalist, Paul Calmly French, who witnessed the conversation and took careful notes. At that moment, Butler knew the conspiracy was real, well-funded, and dangerous. He also knew that exposing it would put him against some of the most powerful men in America. But he had made his choice. He would not become their dictator. He would become their witness. By late 1934, Smedley Butler understood that he was no longer dealing with rumors or political agitation, but with a genuine and organized attempt to undermine the constitutional order of the United States. The men who had approached him were not eccentrics or they were well-funded, well-connected, and confident that their wealth and influence placed them above the law. Butler also knew that if he spoke carelessly or too publicly, the entire story would be crushed by the same interests that controlled banks, corporations, and much of the press. If he wanted the truth to survive, it had to be placed on official record under oath, in a forum where it could not be dismissed as gossip or slander. In November 1934, Butler contacted the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, a special committee of the United States House of Representatives that had been created to investigate Nazi and fascist propaganda and activities inside the country. The committee agreed to hear him, but the atmosphere was tense. The names Butler was about to mention were among the most powerful in American business and finance. Accusing them of treason was not a small matter. The initial hearings were held in closed session, away from the public and the press, partly to protect the investigation and partly because even the committee members understood how explosive the testimony would be. When Butler took the stand, he did not exaggerate and he did not speculate. He described exactly what had happened. He named Gerald McGuire. He named Robert Sterling Clark. He described the offers of money, the plans to recruit a mass army of veterans, the idea of installing a new unelected authority to run the government while Roosevelt remained a figure. He explained how the plan had been modeled on European fascist systems. He also explained that he had deliberately pretended to cooperate in order to learn more and to gather proof. His testimony lasted hours and was delivered with the calm precision of a man used to giving reports under pressure. At first, it sounded unbelievable. The idea that wealthy Americans would seriously discuss overthrowing their own government seemed too extreme, too theatrical, too much like a cheap political thriller. But Butler was not an ordinary witness. He was one of the most decorated officers in American history, a man with no need for publicity and no obvious reason to invent such a story. The committee members listened carefully, but they knew that his word alone would not be enough. They needed corroboration. That corroboration slowly began to appear. The committee subpoenaed travel records and financial documents. They called witnesses. They examined correspondence. They questioned Gerald Maguire, who denied everything and claimed he was merely a businessman who had been misunderstood. But his own letters told a different story. In private correspondence sent from Europe, he had openly praised Mussolini's methods and described in detail the fascist paramilitary organizations he had studied. These were not the observations of a tourist. They were the notes of a man on a mission. More importantly, the committee heard testimony from Paul Calmly French, the journalist who had accompanied Butler to the meeting with Robert Sterling Clark. French confirmed Butler's account point by point. He testified under oath that Maguire had spoken openly about the need for a fascist-style government in the United States and about building a private army of veterans to impose it. This was no longer one man's story against another's. It was a pattern. Financial records also raised disturbing questions. Large sums of money had been moving through accounts connected to Maguire and his associates, far more than could be explained by normal business activities. The trail did not always lead to clear names, but it clearly led upward, toward circles of wealth and power far beyond a single bond salesman. On February 15, 1935, the committee released its final report. Its conclusion was cautious in tone but explosive in meaning. It stated that the committee had received evidence showing that certain persons had attempted to establish a fascist organization in the United States, that these attempts had been discussed and planned, and that they might have been carried out if the financial backers had decided the time was right. In other words, the United States Congress officially acknowledged that a plot against the government had existed. Smedley Butler had been telling the truth. Yet what followed was not justice, but silence. There were no arrests, no trials, no major prosecutions. Gerald Maguire, who had lied under oath, was not charged. Robert Sterling Clark was not punished. The powerful interests whose money had hovered in the background of the affair were never brought before a court. In many published versions of the report, key names were omitted or obscured. The investigation was closed, the files were archived, and the story began to fade from public view. The reaction of much of the press had already prepared the ground for this outcome. Many major newspapers had mocked Butler from the beginning, portraying the entire affair as a fantasy or a misunderstanding. Some suggested that the aging general was seeking attention. Others implied that he had been confused or manipulated. Publications with close ties to financial interests treated the story as an embarrassment to be forgotten as quickly as possible. Behind the scenes, the political reality was brutal and cynical. Franklin Roosevelt was fighting not only the Depression but also a growing storm in Europe. He knew that war was likely coming and that the United States would eventually need the full industrial power of the nation to prepare for it. The same corporations and industrialists who had opposed him, and some of whom had been linked to the plot, controlled the factories that would build the ships, planes, weapons, and ammunition of any future war. A direct confrontation with them could paralyze the economy and cripple national defense. Roosevelt chose pragmatism over confrontation. The plot was buried, not because it was harmless, but because it was inconvenient. Butler returned to his private life. But he was no longer the same man. He had exposed something deeply disturbing about the country he had served all his life. He continued to speak out, warning that war and politics were being manipulated by money and power. But his influence slowly faded. He had won the battle of truth, but he had lost the war of memory. The conspiracy had failed, but the system that had made it possible remained. When the investigation ended in 1935, there was no sense of resolution, no dramatic moment of justice, no public reckoning. The official report of Congress had confirmed that a plot to establish a fascist-style organization in the United States had existed, that it had been discussed and prepared, and that it might have been carried out under the right conditions. And yet, almost immediately, the story began to disappear. Newspapers moved on. Politicians changed the subject. The names involved faded from public conversation. It was as if the country had collectively decided that some truths were too dangerous or too inconvenient to remember. For Smedley Butler, the outcome was deeply bitter. He had done exactly what the system claimed to value. He had refused corruption. He had exposed the conspiracy. He had testified under oath. He had told the truth at enormous personal risk. And in the end, nothing had happened. The men who had tried to recruit him remained wealthy, respected, and free. The institutions that had sheltered them remained powerful. Butler himself was quietly pushed to the margins of public life. He was no longer useful to those in power, and he was too uncomfortable to be celebrated. He continued to speak across the country, giving lectures in which he repeated the conclusion he had reached about his own career and about American power. He said that war was a racket, that he had spent most of his life acting as an enforcer for corporate interests, and that ordinary soldiers had paid the price for decisions made in boardrooms. These speeches made him popular with some audiences and deeply unwelcome in others. The press that had once celebrated him as a war hero now treated him as an eccentric, a troublemaker, a man living in the past. When he died in 1940, at the age of 58, there was no great national ceremony. The country he had served and then tried to warn had already begun to forget him. The larger political context explains much of what happened next. By the late 1930s, the world was sliding toward another global war. Hitler was rearming Germany. Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia. Japan was expanding in Asia. Franklin Roosevelt knew that. Sooner or later, the United States would be drawn into the conflict. And he also knew something else. Winning that war would require the full industrial power of American business. Steel, chemicals, oil, automobiles, shipbuilding, aviation, explosives. All of it depended on the same corporate giants who had opposed the New Deal and whose names had appeared, directly or indirectly, in the business plot affair. Roosevelt was a pragmatic politician. He had already fought enormous battles to pass his domestic reforms. He had stabilized the banking system. He had launched massive public works programs. But he also understood that a direct war with the entire industrial elite could paralyze the country at the worst possible moment. There is no document that records a secret deal, no written agreement that proves a bargain was made. But the logic of events is clear. The investigation was allowed to confirm the existence of the plot, but not to destroy the men behind it. The story was contained. The system was protected. The priority was stability. In T-Sensei, the business plot was not only a failed coup, it was also a warning that the American political system chose not to fully confront. In the decades that followed, the episode slipped into obscurity. Most history textbooks did not mention it. When it was mentioned, it was often reduced to a strange footnote, an eccentric conspiracy that never really came close to succeeding. Yet the official congressional report says otherwise. It states plainly that the plans were real, that they were discussed seriously, and that they might have been carried out under different circumstances. This was not fantasy. It was an aborted crime. What makes the story uncomfortable is not only what was planned, but how easily it was buried. The men involved were not foreign agents or marginal extremists. They were part of the American establishment. They sat on corporate boards. They funded political organizations. They moved comfortably in the highest circles of power. They did not see themselves as traitors. In their own minds, they were patriots, saving the country from what they believed was chaos, socialism, or revolution. Like many such movements throughout history, they believed that democracy was acceptable only as long as it produced the right results. Smedley Butler's role in all of this is what gives the story its moral center. He was not a perfect man. He had spent much of his life enforcing the very system he later criticized. But when he was offered a chance to become something extraordinary, something terrifying, a dictator in all but name, he refused. He chose the Constitution over power. He chose the country over ambition. He chose to tell the truth, even though he knew it would cost him influence, friendships, and reputation. The tragedy is that his warning was only partially heard. The business plot failed, but the forces behind it did not disappear. They adapted. They learned that overt coups were risky and unnecessary. In the modern world, power could be exercised more quietly through lobbying, campaign finance, media influence, and regulatory capture. Why overthrow a government when you can shape its decisions from the inside? Why march on Washington when you can buy access to it? In that sense, the business plot belongs not only to the past, but to a larger pattern in history. Again and again, in different countries and different eras, moments of crisis produce the same temptation. When fear becomes dominant, when economic systems seem to fail, when societies feel unstable, some people begin to argue that freedom is a luxury, that order matters more than consent, that efficiency matters more than rights. The language changes. The justification changes, but the underlying impulse remains the same. The United States in 1933 came closer to that edge than most people realize. It did not fall because one man refused to step aside when offered a crown. Smedley Butler is not remembered with monuments or national holidays, but his story remains one of the clearest reminders of how fragile democratic systems can be, and how much they sometimes depend on individual choices made in quiet rooms far from public view. He proved that the most important battles are not always fought on distant battlefields. Sometimes they are fought at a table, across from a suitcase full of money, with nothing but conscience as a weapon. The business plot was buried, but it was never truly erased, and that may be its most important lesson.